Welcome everyone. My name is Becca Tanel, and I am the Program and Outreach Coordinator here at the Chapman. Very nice to have you guys here today. Tonight we are super lucky because we're going to get to hear from Dr. Sullivan, and he will be discussing his new book, Constructing Disability After the Great War, Blind Veterans in the Progressive Era. So in his book, Dr. Sullivan investigates the lives of blind soldiers and veterans from the First World War, and he's going to reveal how they confronted barriers. They also engaged in education, they earned a living, managed their self-image, all while kind of having to battle the public scrutiny of their successes and failures. When he isn't writing books or book chapters or scholarly articles, the man does a lot of writing. He is assistant professor of history at the Adirondack. And as a historian, he focuses on how disability, war, and gender all intersect in the modern era. So I will turn it over to Evan to talk.
Thank you, Becca. I hope you don't mind. I have a mask on. I'm not sick, but I have a newborn at home, and she was preemie, and so I don't want to get sick. Yeah, so I'm just taking precautions. Thank you. It's our. Yes. Yeah. So who knows? I could be sick, and I'm not showing symptoms, but hopefully not. So I'm here to talk about my book, Constructing Disability After the Great War. It was published in October, so it's still pretty new. I recently had back in November, I had a book launch at Mean Max that was really fun, getting people together to talk about this. I've done a few book talks so far on this subject. Most of my other book talks were kind of very formal, and I had slideshows and talked about the arguments and stuff within the book. And I kind of wanted to do something a little bit more relaxed, and instead of talking about the arguments and the evidence and things like that, talk about the research process and still get into some of the overarching themes of the book, but take you sort of on a journey from the beginning of this research project to its publication. Some of the places that I went, some of the archives I visited, and what I found, because this was a transformative journey for me as I was going through this process. So I'll start off with this image here. And a lot of people ask me, how did you come to write a book about blind veterans after World War I?
Yeah.
Right? It's a very niche subject, like a lot of historical scholarship is. But this is really niche. And what I usually tell them is something similar to this story that I'm about to tell you. I was a master's student at SUNY Albany back in 2015. And as a master's student at the University at Albany, you don't have to write a thesis, but you do have to write a research paper, right? And so the research paper process involves consulting primary sources, involves looking at what other historians have already written about a certain subject. And the closest place that I could find that had primary sources in an archive was the New York State Archive, which was really close to SUNY Albany. And so I knew I was interested in World War I, right? That was the definite focus. But within World War I, who knows, right? So I noticed that they had a whole collection of documents related to New York State education policy during the war. And what was really interesting about this collection of sources was they had journals from an education program that ran during the war that took kids from city schools and sent them out to rural farms to help learn how to do agriculture and support the war effort and things like that. And these kids kept journals. It was part of their assignment, right? And so all the journals are kept in this collection. And so I read through some of those. But my dissertation advisor noticed that there was the travel journal of the New York State Education Commissioner, a guy named John H. Finley, that was also in this collection. He was overseeing a lot of education policy. And in 1917, he decides to go to France to see what the French are doing. They've been involved in this war since 1914. How are they handling education during this tumultuous time? And so I looked at this diary. It's about this thick, very small. And it recounts his experiences in France. He goes there in I think, June of 1917. And which, interestingly enough, is almost 100 years to the day that I went and saw the journal, because I was there in June of 2015. And tucked within one of the pages was a little pamphlet for a rehabilitation center for blind French soldiers that he visited while he was there. And this piqued my interest. I was like, okay, I'd never thought about looking at the experiences of disabled veterans, let alone blind veterans, right? And this got me interested in exploring not just the French experience, right, but also the American experience, because the United States joins the war in 1917. About a couple 100,000 American soldiers, give or take a few, are wounded or disabled in the war. And so I was curious if there are rehabilitation schools in France for French soldiers. There had to be something in the United States, right? And so this sent me on a journey. The first thing I did when I got home is I Googled, right? I Googled rehabilitation, blind, World War I, United States. And this brought up a collection called the War Blind Collection. And the War Blind Collection is held at one of the first schools for blind education in the United States, Perkins School for the Blind in Watertown, Massachusetts. And so the following month, I decided to go there, right? I had already been planning a trip there to take a German language course. And so I decided to just make it a bigger trip and go visit their archive. And this is a wonderful campus. It's really a Victorian feel to it. Children go to school there year round, and adolescents go to school there and learn how to navigate the world as a blind person or as a visually impaired person. And their War Blind collection is all about the American and French experience during World War I and how both countries navigated care for blind people, education, vocational training, things like that. And so I spent about a week in their archive, went back for a second trip, and came away with a good understanding of how Americans talked about war blindness. And some of the ways that Americans talked about, because Americans were, though they didn't enter the war until 1917, they were very interested in reading newspaper articles and journal articles and magazine articles about the war experience, right? And from 1914 to 1917, while the United States isn't officially involved in the war, Americans are reading about soldiers blinded in battle. And the image of the blind soldier, the war-blinded soldier, becomes a major image in American news media, right? It becomes a major image. This is a relatively small proportion of the overall numbers of disabled veterans, right? There's only probably in the thousands, maybe under 10,000 total in all countries. So it's a very small number of soldiers who are actually blinded in the war. But they play, what I found is they play an outsized role in culture. The image of the blind soldier captivates many Americans, right? And you have leading American progressives during this time going over to France, creating whole organizations to aid blind French soldiers. And so groups of mostly middle and upper class Americans go over there. They write about their experiences in places like the New York Times. And Americans are sort of digesting a lot of the ideas that they're writing. And these ideas oftentimes portrayed blind soldiers in a very sort of paternalistic way, in a sort of sometimes a degrading way, right? That these were nothing if not pitiable or depressed or tragic figures who lost their sight in the heat of battle and who needed saving from primarily American relief workers. And these are two images that one organization uses in their appeal to Americans, right? They send these appeals to American citizens, American civilians to donate money, right? It's your dollars and cents that will help these tragic figures from becoming despondent, depressed, and suicidal, right? One appeal even claims that a soldier, without your help, might even reach for the gun, right? Sort of giving you the sense that he would take his own life. But these are two images from American artists. They were commissioned to draw up images that would then be placed on collection boxes and pamphlets that were mailed out to hundreds of thousands of people in the United States. And so this one was on a pamphlet, and I actually took a picture of the pamphlet and cropped this piece out. But if you hold the pamphlet, it has the image on the front, which shows a blind soldier being led by a child, right, showing that the child is sort of in a position of authority over the blind individual. And if you turn over the pamphlet, it has these big, bold letters sort of pressuring you into helping out this soldier who, without your help, would be left to a dark and depressing future where he can't support his family. And it plays on all of these emotions, right, of Americans to do your bit, even though you're not part of the war yet, to do your bit to help these depressed figures find light, despite their blindness, right? And again, these are very emotionally charged appeals to American society, primarily happening in 1915 and 1916, right? And these are some of the images and stories that I first encountered about blind soldiers. And going into this with no experience in disability history, no previous knowledge of disability studies, the lives of disabled people, blindness, disabled veterans, I was sort of, and part of me is ashamed to say it, I was sort of captivated by these stories, right? They drew me in, and I felt a sort of an emotional connection to the images that were portrayed in these newspapers. I I sort of, in a way, bought into the romanticism of it all. And through the process of researching, I slowly chipped away at that, right? By reading scholars of disability history and also reading the experiences of the blind veterans themselves, which I'll come to in a little bit. Another trip to Boston uncovered a really fascinating source that I utilize in the first chapter of my book. The first chapter of my book recounts the experiences of Americans who go overseas before U.S. involvement, right? So starting in late 1914 and going through 1915 and 1916, I recount some of the major events of the early stages of the war and how Americans fit within that story as they're aiding blind soldiers. And the pamphlet that was in John Finley's diary was from an American organization. So if you go to New York City, there's the New York Association for the Blind. It's now called the Lighthouse. It's an organization that helps educate blind people. It's still around today. Its founder, a woman named Winifred Holt, she's the one who goes to France and organizes a lot of these institutions. And that's one of the institutions that John Finley goes to. Now, one of the nurses who helps out Winifred Holt at one of these hospitals, at these vocational training centers, left some records, including testimony of her experiences, a video interview that she gives later on in her life, and some correspondence with actual French veterans who are going through this process of rehabilitation. And the Schlesinger Library at Harvard has these records. And one of the ways that disability historians do their work is to understand and recount the actual lived experiences of people with disabilities, rather than the projections of non-disabled people about disabled people, because those are usually colored by prejudice, bias, right? And so one of the ways that I was able to do this, because for most of history, people with disabilities didn't leave written records of their own experiences, was through looking at the records of this nurse, because she's in contact with these soldiers even after she leaves the hospital. So she's able to provide a different lens through which to understand this process, which gives me a little bit of a different understanding of French blind soldiers than we see through some of these images, right? We see through these letters and through images of actual photographs of these men in training, that they're finding camaraderie in each other's presence, that they're doing things that normal young 18-year-old guys do, right? Joke around, smoke cigarettes at this time, right? They're normal people. They're not the romanticized images that were auctioned off at American charitable foundations in New York City. Then I made a inquiry to the U.S. National Archive, because I found out that there was a rehabilitation hospital in Baltimore for American soldiers. So the United States enters the war in, I believe, April of 1917. And the number of blind American soldiers as a result of war service numbers in the hundreds. It's not a huge amount, right? And these soldiers ended up at a hospital based in this building. National Archives came back and emailed me and said, yes, we have records for this institution. There are thousands of records, and you're free to come and look at them. So I think I went on 3 or 4 trips to the National Archive to view those. And while I was there, I explored the actual building that this hospital was located in. And it's now part of Loyola University campus in Baltimore. But in World War I and in its aftermath, it was U.S. Army General Hospital number 7. Beautiful, beautiful Victorian building. The grounds are immaculate, and very little has changed. It's actually a humanities building now. But I had the guts to walk in and got weird looks from people when I decided to do that, but it was totally worth it. This is an image of the building then, right? That's what it looked like actually as the hospital. And it was built onto this. It was a private estate of a wealthy woman from Baltimore who donated it to the for use as a hospital. And so they built on things like a swimming pool, a bowling alley, covered walkways so that blind soldiers could get around and from one building to another pretty easily. I visited the Maryland Historical Society, which is now called the Maryland Society for History and Culture. They have a whole host of photographs of everyday life at this institution during its operation. A photography company goes there and takes photographs of the soldiers and what they're doing. And so that provides a whole nother set of source material in addition to the institutional records that I was able to find at the National Archives. But I found also that something similar was going on between the ways that Americans were portraying French soldiers in the media and the ways that American soldiers were being portrayed in American media, right? So what happens is many Americans are portraying the French soldiers as sort of depressed, down on their luck, in the darkness, without hope, right? When American soldiers come home, it's not good for national security and national optimism to portray American soldiers that way. There is a whole new program for veterans that comes about as a result of World War I. Rather than adhering to just pensions, which is what Civil War soldiers utilized, World War I soldiers were some of the first to utilize rehabilitation, which is something that still exists today, right? That vocational training and medical rehabilitation, that's born out of the World War I experience, right? And it made sense for newspapers, magazines, including magazines published by the U.S. Army, to sell rehabilitation. It's a new thing. It's important that the public knows that it's there, that it's a change, and that it's beneficial to society to do this training with these veterans. And so what happens is we get a shift in the ways in which blind soldiers are portrayed in American media. No longer those depressed and down and out men. They are possibly depressed and down and out, but through rehabilitation, they're going to pick themselves up and they'll be better off than before, right? It's that plucky American idealism that is so prevalent in the progressive era. And one of the figures, we see this in photographs, right? One of the figures who's central to a whole lot of media coverage of American veterans at this hospital, it's a guy named William Zimmerman. Now, Zimmerman had a storied career in the military. He served on the border with Mexico. He served overseas in many facets, and then he goes to France. He is a truck driver transporting munitions from one part of the battlefield to another. And his truck flips over. He lands upside down in a shell hole, and it severs his optic nerves. So he's blind for the rest of his life. And he becomes a motivational figure because he very quickly becomes a central figure in photographs and newspaper articles and magazines and journals, right? And part of the reason for this is because he's relatively bodily whole. He doesn't have an amputation or any other visible scarring on his body. He's visually compelling as a young white man. And he provides sort of a compelling tale for the rehabilitation experience, right? And this argument that we see throughout the course of American entry into the war is that yes, these soldiers are suffering a huge calamity, as they would say, but they're able to pick themselves up pretty easily through individual grit, through hard work, right, and things like that, right? So I was able to find those photographs at the Library of Congress. I then went to the National Archives, and this is a photograph. When you go to the National Archives, what you do is you have to look through these massive binders that tell you what collections they have, and you don't always know what's in the boxes when you look through these things. So you kind of have to take a shot in the dark sometimes and say, okay, this box is titled World War I Organization Records, Medical Department, Baltimore, Maryland. Maybe that has something to do with this hospital. Who knows, right? But you just request a whole cart and see what happens. And you spend the whole day or multiple days combing through these boxes that have thousands of records in them. And so I spent weeks going through the medical department records, looking at not just the Baltimore hospital, but what were other hospitals doing at this time? What about Walter Reed? What about Plattsburgh, New York? What about Buffalo? What about New York City? And understanding the general culture of rehabilitation, because it's not just a story about blind veterans; it's also a story about disabled veterans as a whole during this experience. And one of the interesting things that I find is that some of these institutional records provide really fascinating insight into the daily lives of these soldiers in a way that I never could have imagined, right? One example that in some ways goes against some of the positive propagandistic stories of people like William Zimmerman is evidenced through this image here. And what you're looking at is a disciplinary report. And so at each hospital, regardless of where it was, there were military police, right? And there were certain standards that soldiers had to abide by, right? It was military discipline. They weren't veterans yet. They were still soldiers in the U.S. Army, despite the fact that they were wounded and recovering. And so there were certain things that you had to do. You couldn't, bless you, you couldn't drink alcohol. You couldn't be out past curfew. You had meals at certain times of the day, right? It was pretty standard. And that means that there were mechanisms in place for soldiers who went against policy. Andrew Neville was one of these soldiers. And through extensive disciplinary records that existed in one of these folders, I came across a really interesting story of a young soldier and two of his friends who go out in the city of Baltimore at night and party. Right? They go out on a binge drinking experience, and they come back and start to wake up all of their fellow blind soldiers. And everyone sleeps in these big barracks, right? They're not individual hospital rooms or anything. And so they go up and down the aisles with their canes and waking people up and smashing windows and throwing records and having a grand old time. And the authorities come in, the military police come in, and they say, essentially, you've got to stop this, right? You got to go to bed and sober up. And they say, essentially, you can't make me. I'll hit you if you try to make me go to bed. And so a fight breaks out, a fist fight between these three soldiers and the guards. And it goes on for a while. And they finally get these soldiers into the guardhouse. And it becomes this whole thing. But what was interesting is that none of this is recounted in the newspaper, right? None of this is in any magazine. None of it's even in the official journal of the U.S. Army Medical Department, which is not meant for public viewing, right? And so this gives a whole different side of the blind soldier experience, right? That it wasn't necessarily this romantic crusade to overcome any physical setback you may have, in the words of rehabilitationists. These were just ordinary people who were valorized in the media. And oftentimes, blind soldiers were held up to an impossible standard that other disabled veterans just couldn't meet, right? That there was the sense that blind soldiers, blind veterans had the worst possible injury from the war, but they're making good. They're doing well. So why are you not doing well? Why are you not making good? And so they become a compelling story to then go to amputees or facially wounded soldiers, right? And sort of motivate them. But this doesn't fit that bill, right? One of the more challenging aspects of going through these records is understanding the realities of combat and what modern warfare could do to the human body. I was very fortunate to be in contact with some family members, descendants of blind soldiers, and some of them shared a whole host of information for me about their great-grandfather's experiences during rehabilitation, during the war, photographs, testimonies, things like that. And I corresponded with the descendant of this soldier before finding this photograph. And so I got a chance to understand his life a little bit and who he was as a person. And so when I came across some of these images of soldiers shortly after their wounding and as they're going through the surgical process, it was kind of, you almost felt like you knew the person in some ways, right? And as a historian, as a scholar, you got to sort of detach yourself from the subjects a little bit. But In some cases, it's kind of hard to do that when you know about these people and you're reading about these people, right? And so this photograph and other photographs like it were kind of just made you stop in your tracks a little bit through the research process, right? And I found this at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. It's both the photograph, but also medical notes about the surgery. I think he goes through 4 or 5 surgeries to get back to some semblance of normality, right? This is a photograph shared with me by his grandson, Chris, their wedding photograph. So I saw that first before I saw the other one as part of this process. One of the sources that I consulted, how much time do I have? Am I pretty good?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Just want to make sure I'm not keeping you forever. One of the sources that I consulted that's available online, it's free to view, was called the Evergreen Review. And it's a magazine that the hospital publishes about the subjects who are taking classes there. As I recount in one of the chapters, the U.S. Army hospital, after everyone's demobilized, it transitions to Red Cross control. Okay, and the Red Cross institutes all these changes to make things better for the people taking classes there. Individual rooms rather than barracks, better meals, dining room, all kinds of things. And one of the things they do is they create a magazine to showcase the work they're doing, right? And much like all of the other written work about these soldiers, Evergreen Review gives a particular story to its readers. These are people of the public who can subscribe to the Evergreen Review. And they showcase success. A lot of the veterans in the columns they talk about how the Red Cross has helped them transition to civilian life, set up businesses, become professionals in different ways. These 2 men are featured prominently in the Evergreen Review. James Rittervold, who is a Norwegian immigrant who serves in the war and becomes blind. He goes on to create a coffee shop in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Harvey Gilbert goes on to open a general store, right? And the opening of these stores is covered quite a bit in the Evergreen Review, and it's mostly positive. It's okay. This is how many people came to purchase things. It was a great first day, but after that, they disappear. There's no follow up to say, okay, here's how they're doing. But through newspapers.com and other newspaper archives, I was able to keyword search their names to see if they were interviewed or written about in local newspapers. And they were. It turns out that James Rittervold, and it's not like they were on the front pages of the papers. They were sort of like on page 19 with a small column, right? But James Rittervold, he struggled because, according to him, the people, he was willing to sell his coffee and tea anywhere in Boston without a delivery fee. But he claimed that people wouldn't support him because of his blindness. Maybe they thought he was incompetent or something like that, right? And so he gets help from a collection of wealthy women in Boston to plead his case to the public. This helps turn his business around. But he confronts barriers that arguably disabled people confront today, of the public being unwilling to support their businesses or ventures. Bottom left, Harvey Gilbert. His business opens. He creates his store, but eventually he comes back to Evergreen because he's poor. His store doesn't work out. Similar experience as James Rittervold. Evergreen Review doesn't cover that. Other rehabilitation magazines don't cover that. New York Times doesn't cover that. None of the major papers of record cover any of these experiences. It's not compelling. It doesn't sell rehabilitation to the public, right? This was one of the hardest things for me to research. It's a guy named Charles Parker Braithwaite. And he was from Barbados, I believe. He migrated to New York before World War I. He served in World War I in combat. He was in the 369th Infantry, which was the famed Harlem Rattlers or the Harlem Hellfighters. Henry Johnson was part of the Harlem Rattlers. There's Henry Johnson Boulevard in Albany. There's a statue of him in Albany. That unit is given over to the French because many African Americans in World War I are relegated to labor battalions. And part of the reason for this is because then they wouldn't be serving in combat with white soldiers and white officers, especially those from the South, right? And so the 369th was transferred to the French as a combat unit because the French had all this experience using colonial soldiers from Algeria and Morocco and Madagascar and Indochina in their armies on the Western Front. And so they had no qualms about using African Americans. And so Charles Parker Braithwaite and the 369th, I think they served the most continuous consecutive days in combat of any unit from the United States. And he's blinded in his service. He comes home, much like his white counterparts. There's evidence in newspaper reports of some white soldiers and a couple black soldiers having a jovial relationship with each other, right? Just average interactions. But there's also some evidence of less savory experiences. So there's very little in the institutional records about Braithwaite and the 5 other black soldiers who are blinded and go to that hospital. The only evidence that exists really is lists of casualty reports, and next to their name it'll say colored, right? Or there is a document that I found that was labeled recreation for colored soldiers, and it was a different recreation schedule from the recreation schedule for white soldiers. Evergreen Review doesn't talk about black soldiers, doesn't highlight their experiences. The only reference to black soldiers in the Evergreen Review happens to be photographs where they're standing in the background, right? Where I was able to find out more about Charles Parker Braithwaite was looking through the pages of the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, the black-run newspaper in Baltimore. And there are other newspapers in Baltimore at this time, but those mostly cater to white audiences, white readerships. And Braithwaite is interviewed by a reporter from the Baltimore Afro-American about his experiences at this hospital. He was there under Army control. He was there under Red Cross control. And by the time the Red Cross takes over, he was the only Black soldier left there. Everyone else had left, according to his testimony, because of racism. Remember, it's Baltimore, the South, Jim Crow era. And he held out for the Red Cross, but found that things only got worse, right? He was relegated to his own separate dining room, which was just a room. Told that if he didn't like it, they'd give him money to go find a meal in the city somewhere. Remember, he's a blind soldier in a new city that he maybe never been to before. So navigating that city might be a challenge for anybody. And so he gets to the point where he basically says, I can't take this anymore. I'm leaving, going back to New York, and finding services that are more hospitable. And so it was through looking at those newspaper records from the Baltimore Afro-American that I was able to piece together some of these experiences along with some of the sparse records in the institutional archives to get a broader sense of what the racial factor was in this hospital. Interestingly enough, I did find reference to Charles Parker Braithwaite in a mainstream newspaper. And it was a very small article, and it touted the fact that Braithwaite was in New York at a institution for blind people, taking training in Braille, in dictaphone operation, and that Uncle Sam sent him there to get the best treatment possible. No mention that he left on his own accord. No mention that he could have gotten the same services at that hospital in Baltimore that his white counterparts had with no problem. And those silences in the historical record are loud, right? Are very loud. And so while there were only 5 or 6 Black soldiers who returned with some form of visual impairment, there were ways in which I was able to reconstruct their experiences the best that I could. Then finally, another really interesting source that I consulted was the American Legion Weekly magazine, which is a magazine that I think might still be in existence. At least it ran throughout most of the 20th century. And it was a weekly periodical. It had all kinds of different news stories related to military service and veterans and rehabilitation and things like that. And there were some articles about blind soldiers, but more importantly, for my purposes, there were a few articles written by blind soldiers. And one of the most interesting figures that I found throughout this process of researching and writing was a guy named Frank Pyle. And he writes a couple columns for the American Legion Weekly about his experiences at this hospital. And he's a funny guy, really hilarious. He recognizes the public attention and sympathy that images like this generated. And the hospital where he went, there were people from the public visiting all the time, every weekend at least, coming to see blind soldiers, maybe bring them out to lunch, dine with them, bring them to the movies, right? There were all kinds of people going to check out the hospital and meet the soldiers, with that sort of idea that they're helping them acclimate to their post-war life, become happier, right? Things like that. And Frank Pyle, I don't have an image of him. I do have one, but it's not on this slide. Frank Pyle recognizes that that this situation he's in at the hospital is kind of comical. And he compares his experience to that of a caged monkey at a zoo, where he calls him and his comrades the blind apes being fed peanuts. And he also talks about how he misleads civilian visitors who come to talk to them and ask them about their war experience. And so he says all these just wild tales about how they lost their sight. Like, I tried to stop a Red Cross worker from going over the top, and it became too much for me, so I went blind, or just outrageous things that make no sense, but knew that the gullible public would buy into it. And so he provides this sort of comical relief to all of these more serious stories in a way that really brings a lot of the day-to-day life kind of to the fore. And so I include a lot of that in the book as well. So this journey started with me knowing nothing about disability history, knowing nothing about blind soldiers or blind veterans, getting into the archives and being sort of captivated by those early stories, reading scholarship on disability studies, reading about the experiences of the soldiers themselves, and correcting my own misperceptions in the process, right? And so this is a story about them, but it's also a journey for myself on reconceptualizing the experience of disabled veterans during this era, right? And so that was a amazing experience to go through. Any scholar will tell you that researching and writing is just unparalleled experience and opportunity. And this is one of the reasons why, is because you go through this process of discovery that's just fascinating. So that's it. That's all I have for you. But willing to take questions if you have some.